Shabbat Shalom, folks. This was one of those weeks where on Monday and Tuesday, I'm like, what am I going to talk about this week? Many times over the past many years, I have stood here and spoken about how the first couple of chapters of Exodus offer us a blueprint for sustained and sacred protest against tyranny. And many times we have noted in this community how the timeless text of Shemot, of the book of Exodus, is profoundly timely for us today. Pharaoh is threatened by the thriving Israelite population within the borders of Egypt. And so he conceives of increasingly desperate and progressively inhumane approaches to try to quash the body and the spirit of the people, whom he perceives to be a fifth column, dangerous interlopers in his land. He torments and he enslaves the Israelite people with crushing harshness. He appoints brutal taskmasters who make their lives bitter with breathless labor. The cruelty then, as now, is precisely the point. But the people persevere, and somehow the more they're oppressed, the more they seem to flourish. And so Pharaoh grows increasingly agitated and unhinged. And he, the chief architect, after all, of an empire sustained by fear and by animus, remains convinced that the enslaved Israelites' continued vitality poses an existential threat to his power. Enslavement, he determines, is insufficient. He needs to erase the Israelites' future. And this is when Pharaoh coldly orders that newborn Hebrew baby boys must be murdered on the birth stool, a demand that the Hebrew midwives flatly refuse. Finally, Pharaoh commands the entire people of Egypt, every boy that is born to you shall be thrown into the Nile, and let every girl live. It is that last command that enlists the entire nation into Pharaoh's fight, ordered, like it or not, to rise up against their neighbors and perpetrate the most abhorrent act of violence, which is infanticide. Pharaoh, like so many tyrants after him, shows here his willingness to have the Egyptian population murder their own babies and one another's in order to quash the perceived threat of the Hebrews. It is the most sinister of plans, a dark and urgent reminder to us that desperate rulers will justify anything. They will risk literally everything and everyone in order to defeat their perceived enemies and hold on to their power. The story of the midwives, Shifra and Puah, is tucked into this narrative, and it is in every way a story for our time. Two women quietly and humbly defying the orders of the most powerful man in the ancient world. Their inclusion makes this biblical text the one that is probably most likely to pass the Bechdel test, in which at least two named women have to talk to each other about something other than a man. And it's true that the Torah doesn't record their conversations with each other, but I think it's safe to say that that is a reasonable projection of what went on between Shifra and Puah. The midwives' story is what caught my eye this week. It is certainly an idea whose time has come. Shifra and Puah have become household names in our time, in an era searching for and eager to elevate stories of courageous women. But Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Grumet, in his book on Exodus, points out the seeming superfluousness of this story, an unnecessary sidebar in the midst of an epic narrative of a tyrant and his quest for total domination. While the story is certainly interesting, Grumet posits, it seems on the surface to be unnecessary. The omission of the story of Shifra and Puah would not affect anything at all in the narrative. And the subversion of these midwives, who of course defy Pharaoh's command, does not ultimately derail Pharaoh. Even after they risk their lives in defiance, the engine of injustice continues to churn in Egypt. So what does the Torah mean to teach us by including the story of the midwives? I want to ask us on this Shabbat to pay attention to some of the wisdom of this ancient text, whispers from the past that I believe deserve to be shouted from the pulpit at the close of a week like the one we just lived through. Pay attention to the pronouns. I don't mean this in the way that you might imagine. I'm not talking about how Fox News immediately reported that Renee Nicole Good, may her memory be a blessing, included her pronouns in her social media. Their not at all subtle signal that she was unworthy of their viewers' sympathy. She stands on the other side of history, the woke side. In other words, she asks for it. She deserved it because of she, her. I don't mean those pronouns. I mean the pronouns that are used in the Torah here. The Hebrews are spoken of by Pharaoh not as they, them, but as it. Not in the plural, but in the singular. Let us outsmart it, lest it become numerous. Here, Pharaoh is modeling a psychological move that is absolutely essential in the process of dehumanization, the reduction of the multitudes of Israelites into one single non-human entity. In contrast, when Pharaoh begins issuing his harsh decrees against the Israelite people, those decrees are issued in the plural. They appointed taskmasters over it, signaling that among the Egyptian leadership, there was some kind of broad consensus in the persecution of the Hebrews. You might remember the interpretation that appears in the Talmud in Masechet Sota that indicates that Pharaoh really did not act alone, but in concert with his advisors, Bil'am, who helped him conceive of the most sadistic of those policies, Job, who remains silent in the face of the unjust decrees, and Yitro. Well, Yitro fled in protest, which protected his conscience, but left the people without any defenders in Pharaoh's cabinet. It's within this context that the story of Shifra and Puah emerges, painting their actions as a stunning counter-testimony to the weak-kneed, sycophantic capitulation of those advisors, the people who should have known better, the people who were in power to stop the tyrant, but chose not to. Shifra and Puah did not have that kind of power, but they saw the world very differently than Pharaoh did. They saw the Hebrew babies not as nameless, faceless members of a mass, but as individuals, each one created in God's own image. And so they broke the law, and they countered the norms which the entire elite of Egyptian society had already decided that they would abide in casting their lot with the tyrant and creating a vast moral vacuum among the leadership in Egypt. The failure of all of those leaders and advisors to resist that tyrant did not stop these women from stepping into the arena. They understood disobedience to be not a choice, but a moral and spiritual necessity in the face of tyranny. They got into their minivan, you see. They blocked the road as the law enforcement approached. Maybe our presence here will send some kind of message, they thought. We will not stand by as you terrorize our neighbors and our neighborhood. Maybe we will save one life. But was it worth the risk? Did Shifra and Puah really believe that they could stop the machinery of Pharaoh's cruelty? Can any of us stop the machinery of the cruelty? Can two women stop an army, emboldened by a tyrant paying signing bonuses of $100,000 each for the services of his personal army? No, they could not stop the army. As we see immediately after Shiphrah and Puah's last stand against Pharaoh, the decree against all the baby boys is passed. Do you see what happens here? Things get worse, not better. So what then is the meaning, the moral meaning of their defiance? Shiphrah and Puah remind us that even if you cannot arrest the march of injustice, your work and mine is to do everything in our power to slow it down. We would be naive to think that our defiance will reap immediate rewards. But remember this, thousands of years later, it is Shiphrah and Puah's names and their courage that is remembered, whereas the reigning pharaohs are remembered only by their titles and their cruelties. The midwives teach that we may feel powerless, but we are not powerless. We must remember that the great might of the fiercest tyrants can be slowed down, can be undermined, can be thwarted by regular, decent people, people of conscience, who search and seek and find creative ways to fight back. Shiphrah and Puah cannot overthrow Pharaoh's regime, and neither, I am afraid, can we. But we can muck up the machinery of injustice. We can and we must. And lest we think that it was just these two women, our rabbis make it clear that the impact of their defiance was reverberative. Ibn Ezra points out that these two midwives oversaw more than 500 midwives across the land of Egypt. So when Shiphrah and Puah acted, word spread throughout the entire midwife community, and many others presumably felt emboldened to follow. The job of a midwife, after all, is to bring life, not to end it. Seforno indicates that ripple effect, the mass defection and defiance, not of two, but of many, was what ultimately forced Pharaoh to give up on his plan altogether and to shift course. Every act of defiance, we learn, is reverberative. And there's more. Shiphrah and Puah are summoned to Pharaoh's court. He wants to understand why these Hebrew babies keep being born when he has ordered them to snuff the babies' lives out as they leave the birth canal. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live, the Torah tells us. They are unequivocal. It was their faith that guided them, their belief in something greater than the here and now, greater even than their supreme and all-powerful leader. And what about us? It is precisely when we can no longer place our trust in our institutions, whether that is media or government or perhaps even universities, that we must root ourselves in something eternal, something bigger than all of that we ground in ancient values that center not the political exigencies of this storm or the next, but the deeper call of our soul. Who are we called to be in the world? What does it mean to be a human being? I know that this might sound like a strange directive from a person who you know feels deeply the urgencies of this moment. But we are going to need to slow down and to listen to the quiet voice of the Spirit. Our time demands that of us because we, like Shiphrah and Puah, will have many difficult choices to make in the days ahead. Faced with the conflict between the laws of God and the laws of Pharaoh, the midwives chose God. I hope that we will find the strength to do the same. In the face of heartache and hardship, our faith can guide us toward what is just and right and help us remember what matters most. And finally, I see in this story an eternal reminder that redemption is born in the most unlikely of places. Pharaoh decreed that those firstborn babies must die after he received a prophecy that the Redeemer of Israel was about to be born. He was terrified, and so he determined that the very best way to subvert that prophecy was to kill all the boys so that the baby boy Redeemer of Israel would never grow and therefore never challenge Pharaoh's power. Twice in this story, Pharaoh states what he perceives to be the real threat against his people and his power. Twice he says, every son must die, but the daughters can live. Why is that? Because Pharaoh did not see the daughters as a threat. He could not imagine that his regime would be challenged by women whom he perceived to be the powerless of the powerless. He couldn't fathom that they could figure out how to amass power by working each of them in their own way and all of them together to use their inner resources to contest and ultimately help overthrow him. And yet, look who stands at the heart of our revolution. The midwives who quietly ignore the decree and allow the Hebrew baby boys to flourish. Miriam and her mother Yocheved, who remain hopeful and continue to invest in the future even when the future appears to be closed. Pharaoh's own daughter, Batia, who resists from within the power structure, herself subverting her father's decree from within his own house. The very people that Pharaoh was unconcerned about become the great force that plant the seeds that would ultimately topple this empire, paving the way for true and collective liberation. And this matters. In fact, it may be the only way that real social change ever happens, when each of us in our own way and all of us together, especially those of us who are dismissed, disregarded, marginalized, ignored, use what we have to confound and undermine and muck up the systems that threaten to degrade and oppress and deny us all. In so doing, Shifra and Pua remind us that we must get very clear not only on what we're fighting against, but what we are fighting for. In the language of Aviva Zornberg, the very extremity of the edict forces a new moral vision upon the midwives, a radical choice between life and death. Disobedience to Pharaoh becomes more than merely a refusal to kill. It becomes a total dedication to nourishing life. So what about us? How will we, in this period, manifest our total dedication to nourishing life in a nation that blithely attacks its own citizens and accuses victims of violence of domestic terror, in a time when elected leaders are unashamed to gaslight the nation regardless of multiple angles of video evidence to the contrary, in a world in which right and wrong are being deliberately obfuscated and violence against the most vulnerable justified as a moral necessity, under a regime that is callous to human suffering, how will we manifest our total dedication to nourishing life? I hope that in the days ahead we will remember Shifra and Pua. I hope that in the most difficult days we will remember two women who did everything in their power to push back against the darkness of the most powerful tyrant in the ancient world. I hope in their spirit we will be willing to smash idols and break wheels too. I hope that we will step into the moral vacuum, that we will muck up the machinery of injustice, that we will use the power we have rather than believe the lie that we have no power. I hope that we will remember that goodness and decency and compassion and kindness and curiosity are contagious. And I hope that we will lean in to our faith, which will be an eternal reminder for us of which way is north. And I hope and I pray that we will draw strength from each other and from the Holy One. Strength not only to push back against evil, but like Shifra and Pua, strength to help give birth to a new and greater good. Shabbat Shalom.